the night he bought her. It wasn't about control. It was about proving he could own anything until she looked at him like he didn't exist. The air inside the auction hall was thick with silence. Not the kind of silence that comes from peace, but the kind that comes from fear. Fear dressed in luxury. Fear disguised as elegance. Fear that no one dared to speak aloud. At the center of this world stood a man who embodied that fear more than anyone else. Dominic Vale. His presence alone altered the atmosphere. People adjusted their posture when he entered. Whispers died before they formed. Eyes lowered instinctively. Because Dominic Vale didn't need to announce power. Power responded to him. He didn't just belong to the elite underground world. He controlled it. And tonight, he intended to remind everyone of that fact. Across the room, the auction stage stood elevated, illuminated by cold, calculated lighting. Each figure presented there was carefully selected, measured, prepared. Yet none of them mattered tonight. Because Dominic wasn't here for options. He was here for impact, for dominance, for proof that no one, no system, no person, no resistance could stand beyond his reach. And then she was brought forward, Lila Mercer. Her entrance was quiet, deliberate, unassuming. There was no dramatic reaction, no visible struggle, no desperate attempt to resist the situation she had been placed in. But that absence of reaction was not weakness. It was control. She stood under the lights, her expression unreadable, her posture steady. She did not skim the crowd with panic. She did not lower her gaze in submission. Instead, she observed, not the people, not the wealth, not the power, but the structure, the environment, the hierarchy. She was studying the room the same way one would study a system before dismantling it. And Dominic noticed. Immediately, the moment his eyes landed on her, something shifted, not in her, but in the way he perceived her. She was not reacting the way others did, not trembling, not pleading, not breaking. That alone made her different. But what truly captured his attention was the absence of fear. Fear was currency in his world, and she refused to spend it. The auction began. Numbers were called. Bids were raised. Each offered a silent declaration of power. But Dominic remained still, watching, measuring, waiting. The room began to understand something was different. People who usually competed hesitated, because when Dominic Vale showed interest in something, it no longer belonged to the market. It belonged to him, and they knew better than to challenge that. The bids climbed, faster, higher, more aggressive, but they were all background noise, because Dominic had already decided he would not compete. He would claim. The final number was not a negotiation. It was a statement. And when it was announced, the room fell into absolute silence. No one dared to challenge it. No one dared to question it, because everyone understood this was not just a purchase. This was a message. Dominic Vale did not lose. He did not hesitate. He did not fail to acquire what he wanted. And tonight, he had just taken something no one else could even approach. A quiet nod sealed the deal. The gavel struck. The transaction was complete. In that moment, something shifted across the room. Fear deepened. Respect intensified. And the hierarchy was reinforced. People did not look at Lila as she was escorted away. They looked at Dominic, because that was where power resided. Or at least, that was what they believed. As Lila was guided off the stage, her eyes moved once. Not frantically, not nervously, just once. And in that brief moment, her gaze aligned with his. For the first time, it wasn't submission. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. And more than that, it was assessment. She looked at him the way one would look at a structure, analyzing, understanding, mapping. And Dominic felt it, not emotionally, but instinctively. That brief connection lasted less than a second, but it left an imprint, because no one looked at Dominic Vale like that, not without consequence. But she did, and she did it without hesitation, without acknowledgement of risk, without concern for what he might do in response. That was the first fracture in the moment, a subtle disruption in what was supposed to be absolute control. As she was taken into the private corridor, Dominic remained seated, still, composed. But something had changed, not in the room, not in the outcome, but in him. He leaned slightly back, eyes fixed in the direction she had been taken, thinking, processing, not what he had acquired, but what he had just encountered, because something about her did not align with the others. Others submitted, others resisted, others broke, but she observed, and that difference was dangerous, dangerous in a way that couldn't be easily identified, couldn't be easily controlled, couldn't be easily eliminated. Dominic had built his entire empire on the ability to categorize people, assets, threats, opportunities, tools, but Lila Mercer did not fit into any of those categories. Not yet, and that uncertainty was new, uncomfortable, and undeniably compelling. As the crowd began to disperse, conversations resumed, carefully, quietly, as if afraid to disturb the lingering presence of what had just occurred. But Dominic didn't move, not immediately, because something had settled within him. Not satisfaction, not victory, but awareness. Awareness that something had entered his world, something that did not behave according to its rules, something that did not react to his authority in predictable ways, something that watched. And that was when the realization began to take shape. He had not just bought a woman. He had introduced an unknown variable into a system that depended on control. And unknown variables are the only things that can disrupt absolute power. Dominic stood, slowly, deliberately. The room instinctively adjusted to his movement, as it always did. But his mind was no longer focused on the crowd, or the transaction, or the display of dominance. It was focused on her, because for the first time, he wasn't thinking about what she could do for him. He was thinking about what she could do to him. And that was a thought he had never allowed before. As he turned to leave the auction hall, the weight of that realization settled deeper. She was not just another acquisition. She was something else, something he had not yet defined, and perhaps something he could not define, because when he looked at her, she did not look like someone who had just been bought. She looked like someone who had just entered a world she intended to understand, and possibly reshape. The doors closed behind him as he exited, but the moment stayed with him. Her gaze, her composure, her silence, all of it lingered, not as submission, but as something far more unsettling. Interest, not in him as a man, but in him as a system. And that was something he could not ignore, because in his world, everything that observes eventually acts, and Lila Mercer was no exception. He believed he had bought her, owned her, controlled her, but in truth, the first move had already been made, and it wasn't his, because the moment he thought she was just another captive, she did something that completely broke his expectation. He expected her to break, but the more pressure he applied, the more unshakable she became. There was an unspoken rule in Dominic Vale's world. Everything submitted. Eventually, everything cracked. Everything yielded under pressure. And if it didn't, he applied more pressure, because control in his world was not negotiable. It was enforced. But when Lila Mercer was brought into his private state, something unusual began to unfold. She did not arrive as someone who had been defeated, nor as someone who had been rescued. She arrived as someone who had simply been relocated, placed, contained, and observed. The estate itself was an extension of Dominic's mind, structured, precise, controlled. Every corridor, every room, every access point was monitored. Nothing moved without his awareness. And Lila was now inside that system. Dominic did not rush. He did not impose immediately. He studied, because power was not just about force. It was about timing. He allowed the silence to stretch. Hours passed, then days. He expected discomfort to build, isolation to weigh, uncertainty to create cracks. That was how most people responded. They broke down in silence. They began seeking approval. They showed vulnerability. But Lila did not. She adapted to the silence, not as something to endure, but as something to use. She explored the space without appearing to explore. She observed the patterns of movement, the routine of guards, the timing of entries and exits, the structure of authority within the estate. And while others might have assumed she was simply waiting, she was calculating. Dominic began testing her, subtle at first, extended isolation, reduced interaction, controlled access to information. Each test was designed to create pressure, to provoke reaction, to reveal cracks. But Lila's reactions were minimal, measured, intentional. She did not respond emotionally. She responded strategically. Where others would have shown frustration, she showed patience. Where others would have resisted, she observed. Where others would have broken, she adapted. And that was something Dominic had not anticipated, because resistance was predictable. Submission was predictable. Breaking was predictable. But adaptation was evolution, and evolution was harder to control. As the days progressed, Dominic increased observation, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to. He told himself it was analysis, a necessary step in maintaining control. But in reality, it was curiosity, and curiosity was dangerous. He began to notice small details, the way she positioned herself in a room, always with awareness of exits, always with understanding of sightlines, the way she paused before making decisions, not hesitating, but calculating, the way she looked at people, not as threats, but as variables, and more importantly, the way she looked at him, not with fear, not with admiration, but with analysis. That unsettled him more than anything else, because in his world, people reacted to him. They feared him. They obeyed him. They adjusted to him. But Lila was studying him, and not in a way that was passive. It was active, intentional, as if she was mapping his patterns, predicting his responses, understanding his control mechanisms. That realization began to shift something within Dominic. At first, it was irritation. No one analyzed him without consequence. Then, it was intrigue, because she was doing what no one else had ever attempted. And finally, it became something else entirely. Attention, focused, unavoidable. He found himself watching her more than necessary, waiting for her reactions, observing her behavior, analyzing her presence. And with each passing day, his control over the situation felt less absolute. Others within his estate began to notice. Guards, assistants, trusted allies. They observed her in passing, not directly, but enough to sense something different. She did not behave like someone who had been taken. She did not act like someone who was out of place. She moved as if she belonged, or worse, as if she was evaluating whether the place was worth belonging to. Whispers began forming, quiet, uncertain, because Lila did not fit into the system they understood, and anything that didn't fit was dangerous. But the most unsettling part was that she never needed to assert dominance. She didn't challenge authority. She didn't confront it. She simply existed within it and subtly adjusted around it. And in doing so, she began influencing it without a single command, without a single confrontation, just presence. Dominic observed this shift with growing intensity because control was supposed to be absolute, unquestioned, unchanged. But something was changing, not in the system, not in the structure, but in the way it responded to her. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. She was no longer reacting to the environment. She was beginning to understand it. And then she began adapting. Deliberately, strategically, she adjusted her behavior in small ways, not enough to raise suspicion, but enough to gain advantage. She learned the rhythms of the estate, the patterns of movement, the psychological tendencies of those around her, and slowly, she began operating within the system, not as a prisoner, but as a participant. That shift did not go unnoticed, especially not by Dominic, because for the first time, someone within his control, structure was no longer reacting to pressure. They were using it, and that was not something he had accounted for. He increased scrutiny, monitoring her more closely, adjusting conditions, testing boundaries further. But each adjustment was met with adaptation, not resistance. Adaptation, and that was more dangerous than rebellion, because rebellion could be crushed. But adaptation meant growth, meant learning, meant evolution, and Dominic began to understand something he had never encountered before. She was not trying to escape. She was not trying to resist. She was learning the structure, learning the system, learning him, and that realization shifted everything, because it meant she was not just surviving, she was preparing for something he could not yet see, something that had not yet revealed itself. And for the first time, Dominic Vale felt something unfamiliar, not control, not dominance, but uncertainty. And in his world, uncertainty was the most dangerous force of all. He stood in the observation room one evening, watching her through the glass, silent, still, analyzing, because the system had not failed. Nothing had broken, but something had changed. And as he watched her move with quiet precision, a realization began to form. She was no longer just a presence within his world. She was becoming part of it. Or worse, she was learning how to control it. And that was when the truth settled in, quiet and undeniable. For the first time, Dominic realized she is not resisting him. She is learning him. His world was built on control, but she was the first thing he couldn't define. The empire of Dominic Vale was not simply powerful. It was engineered. Every layer of it followed structure. Every action had intention. Every individual had a role. There were no accidents in his world, no randomness, no emotional decisions that could disrupt the system, because Dominic believed one fundamental truth. People were assets, useful, disposable, replaceable, and emotions were liabilities. They created unpredictability, and unpredictability was weakness. So he removed it, not from others alone, but from himself. At least, that was what he believed. The empire reflected that mindset in every aspect. Security was layered. Communication was monitored. Access was restricted. Information was controlled with precision. Hierarchy was absolute. Discipline was enforced. And loyalty was not expected. It was ensured through fear, through dependency, through power. No one inside his structure questioned him. No one challenged him. No one stepped outside their assigned role, because those who did not remain within the empire long enough to repeat the mistake. This was the world Lila Mercer had been placed into, but unlike others, she did not resist its structure. She studied it, quietly, observantly, patiently. She began with the obvious: patterns, movement, routine. She observed how guards rotated, how information flowed, how authority was distributed, how decisions were escalated. Nothing escaped her attention. She did not ask questions. She did not interfere. She simply absorbed. And what made her dangerous was that she did not appear to be doing anything at all. To others, she remained quiet, composed, unremarkable. But to someone watching closely, she was gathering pieces, not randomly, not passively, but strategically. She learned which corridors were used most, which areas were heavily monitored, which individuals carried influence within the hierarchy. She identified subtle weaknesses, the hesitation in a guard step, the inconsistency in a schedule, the overconfidence in a subordinate. Each observation became a piece of a larger understanding, and the more she learned, the more she adapted, not visibly, not aggressively, but internally. She was mapping the empire, and Dominic noticed. At first, it was instinct, a sense that something was shifting, subtle, unseen, but present. So he adjusted. He began assigning observers, individuals whose sole purpose was to monitor her behavior, every movement, every pause, every glance, recorded, analyzed, reported. He increased surveillance, but he did not intervene, because intervention meant acknowledgement, and acknowledgement meant giving power to the unknown. Instead, he observed from a distance, through controlled reports, through filtered perspectives. He wanted to understand her, to categorize her, to define her, but every attempt failed, because she did not fit into any of his existing frameworks. She did not react in expected ways. She did not follow predictable patterns. She did not display the usual signs of fear, submission, or rebellion. Instead, she remained undefined. And that was the most dangerous state of all, because what cannot be defined cannot be controlled. Dominic increased pressure, testing her indirectly, altering conditions within the estate, introducing variables, watching for reactions. But each attempt only reinforced one thing. She was not breaking. She was refining, adapting, learning faster than expected, and integrating into the system without disrupting it. That alone was unsettling. But what disturbed him more was that she was doing all of this without revealing intention. There was no visible objective, no overt goal, no clear direction. And yet, her actions were far from random. Everything she did had purpose, just not one he could immediately understand. This lack of clarity created tension, psychological tension, because Dominic had built his entire identity on the ability to understand and control every element within his environment. But Lila challenged that ability without confrontation, without resistance, without force, and that made her presence within his empire feel like a silent disruption. The more he tried to define her, the more elusive she became. The more he attempted to categorize her, the more she shifted outside those boundaries. And slowly, without realizing it, he began focusing more on her than on the empire itself, which was dangerous because control requires balance, and he was beginning to lose that balance. Meanwhile, Lila continued, quietly expanding her understanding of the empire. She identified patterns in communication. She observed behavioral tendencies among key figures. She recognized the structure of influence that existed beneath the surface. And more importantly, she began understanding Dominic, not emotionally, but structurally. She studied how he made decisions, how he responded to disruption, how he maintained authority without visible effort. She recognized his precision, his discipline, his control over both environment and perception. And with each observation, she refined her own behavior, subtle adjustments, calculated positioning, strategic awareness. She did not attempt to overpower the system. She integrated into it, but not as a passive element, as an active observer. And that changed everything, because while Dominic believed he was maintaining control, a new dynamic was forming beneath the surface, one he had not anticipated, one he had not designed, one that existed outside his control structure. She was no longer just within his empire. She was beginning to understand how it functioned, and once that understanding was complete, she would no longer be just a participant. She would be a variable, one that could not be predicted, one that could not be confined, one that could disrupt everything. And that possibility did not sit well with Dominic, because for the first time, he was not entirely certain of the outcome. He had never experienced that before, and he did not like it. So he did what he always did. He observed, he waited, he adjusted. But the difference now was that she was doing the same, and she was learning faster than he expected. More importantly, she was learning him, not as a person, but as a system. And systems can be analyzed, deconstructed, and ultimately understood. Dominic stood within the highest level of his estate one evening, overlooking his empire. Everything he had built, everything he controlled, everything he defined was still intact, still functioning, still aligned with his expectations. And yet, something had shifted, not visibly, but undeniably, because within his controlled empire, there existed something he could not define, and that alone made it dangerous. Not because of what it had done, but because of what it could become. And that realization was enough to unsettle even him, because in a world built on control, the only thing more dangerous than losing power is encountering something you cannot control at all. And somewhere within his carefully structured empire, someone was beginning to notice, not what she was doing, but how she was behaving, because she was not acting like someone who had been captured or contained or controlled. She was acting like someone who was learning the system from the inside, and that observation was about to reach the wrong eyes, because someone within his inner circle starts noticing. She is not behaving like a captive. Control didn't break. It cracked the moment she stopped behaving like she belonged to him. In the world of Dominic Vale, control was not something that faded. It was absolute, or it did not exist at all. There was no in-between, no gray area, no slow erosion. But with Lila Mercer, something had begun to shift. Not loudly, not visibly, but undeniably. At first, it was subtle, almost imperceptible. A shift in timing, a change in presence, a quiet deviation from expectation. She was no longer simply existing within the structure. She was interacting with it in ways that did not immediately reveal intent. But intent was there, carefully embedded beneath every action. She began making small adjustments, not to disrupt, but to influence. A conversation that would have ended abruptly continued longer than expected. A decision that would have been made quickly was subtly delayed. An interaction that would have followed a predictable path diverged just enough to create a different outcome. Nothing overt, nothing visible, but everything intentional. And that was when Dominic noticed. At first, he did not react, because reacting meant acknowledging, and acknowledging meant admitting. Something was changing. Instead, he observed, he analyzed, he looked for patterns, for repetition, for consistency. But what he found was not resistance. It was adaptation. She was not pushing against the system. She was moving within it. And more importantly, she was adjusting it without breaking it, without exposing herself, without triggering alarms. And that was far more dangerous than any act of rebellion, because rebellion is visible. Adaptation is not. Rebellion creates conflict. Adaptation creates influence. And influence is harder to control. As time progressed, Dominic's curiosity deepened, because what he was witnessing did not align with his expectations. Lila did not behave like someone attempting to escape. She did not show desperation. She did not display urgency. She did not resist in obvious ways. Instead, she became more composed, more aware, more deliberate. She stopped reacting emotionally to her environment and instead began responding strategically. This shift did not go unnoticed by others, but more importantly, it did not go unnoticed by him. At first, his response was curiosity, a quiet interest in understanding change. But curiosity has a limit, and once that limit is reached, it evolves. In his case, it became irritation, because something within his control structure was no longer responding as expected, and that challenged the foundation of his authority. Then, that irritation deepened, because the more he attempted to regain control, the more subtle the resistance became. Not direct, not confrontational, but precise, intentional, calculated. She was not rejecting his control. She was navigating around it, and in doing so, she was avoiding confrontation entirely. That frustrated him, because confrontation was something he understood, something he could measure, something he could control. But this was different. This was quiet, controlled, and deeply unsettling. So he increased surveillance, more observation, more monitoring, more structure. He refined his control methods, adjusted variables, introduced new restrictions, changed access points, reinforced boundaries, all with precision, all with intention. But each adjustment was met with an equally subtle counter. Not resistance, not defiance. Adaptation. She learned faster than expected, adjusted quicker than anticipated, and responded without revealing intention. It was as if she was always one step ahead, but never showing it. And that was beginning to disrupt something deep within him, because control is not just external, it is internal. And for the first time, he felt a shift within himself, a lack of certainty, a question forming where there had always been answers. He began watching her more closely, not just her actions, but her patterns, her reactions, her pauses, her silences, because silence can be more revealing than words. But with Lila, even silence was controlled, intentional, calculated. She did not reveal anything unnecessarily. Every action served a purpose. Every movement carried weight. And every absence of reaction was just as meaningful as a reaction itself. This made her impossible to predict, and unpredictability was something Dominic could not allow, but something within him kept observing, kept watching, kept analyzing, because despite the tension, despite the imbalance, despite the disruption, there was something about her that held his attention in a way he could not ignore, and that was dangerous for both of them. As the psychological tension between them increased, so did the unspoken awareness. Neither spoke of it, neither acknowledged it, but both felt it, a growing awareness that this dynamic was no longer one-sided. It was shifting, slowly, quietly, but undeniably. Dominic began to realize that control was no longer something he simply held. It was something he had to maintain, and that required effort, constant, deliberate, unending, because Lila was no longer just existing within his world. She was interacting with it, influencing it, shaping it, and doing so without resistance, which made her far more dangerous than anyone who had ever directly opposed him, because opposition can be crushed, but influence can grow, and what grows can spread, and what spreads can change everything. Lila continued her quiet progression, adjusting, observing, learning. She did not challenge Dominic. She did not confront him. She did not attempt to overpower him. Instead, she refined her understanding of his system. She recognized his patterns, his tendencies, his expectations, and she began aligning herself within that structure, not as a submissive element, but as an adaptive one. She did not break rules. She reinterpreted them. She did not resist authority. She redirected its flow. She did not fight control. She redefined its boundaries. And in doing so, she began to reshape the environment itself, not in obvious ways, but in ways that mattered. And Dominic felt it, subtle at first, but growing, like something shifting just beneath the surface, something he could not fully grasp, but could no longer ignore. He stood within his domain one evening, watching her from a distance, analyzing, observing, trying to identify the moment, the exact moment, when things began to change. But there was no clear moment, no single point of failure, only a gradual shift. And that was worse, because it meant this was not an event. It was a process, and processes are harder to stop. His gaze remained fixed on her, trying to define her, trying to categorize her, trying to bring her back into the framework he understood. But she no longer fit. She had evolved beyond that, beyond his expectations, beyond his definitions, beyond his control. And that realization was the first crack, not in the system, but in his certainty, because certainty is the foundation of control. And when certainty begins to fade, control follows. As he continued watching her, something shifted again, a subtle adjustment in her behavior, a small but deliberate action, one that changed the flow of interaction around her, not dramatically, but meaningfully. And that was when it became clear. For the first time, he realized she is no longer reacting to him. She is shaping the situation. The moment he thought she belonged to him, he realized she never did. In the world governed by Dominic Vale, ownership was not symbolic. It was absolute. Possession meant control. Control meant certainty. And certainty meant power. But everything he believed about that chain of logic was beginning to fracture, because Lila Mercer was no longer fitting into any of his definitions. She had not broken. She had not resisted in the ways he expected. She had not attempted to escape in any visible sense. And yet, something had changed. Something fundamental. She was no longer behaving like someone who belonged to him, not in action, not in presence, not in energy. And that was the moment the illusion shattered. But it did not happen all at once. It unfolded slowly, deliberately, like a truth revealing itself layer by layer. First, it was awareness, not obvious, not announced, but present in the way she carried herself, in the way she observed her surroundings, in the way she responded or chose not to respond. She was no longer passively existing within his structure. She was actively aware of it, every detail, every layer, every constraint. She understood the environment she was placed in, and more importantly, she understood the rules governing it. But unlike others, she did not accept those rules blindly. She evaluated them, analyzed them, and then she worked within them, but not as a subordinate, as an equal force. The subtle shift did not go unnoticed by Dominic. At first, he resisted acknowledging it, because acknowledging it meant admitting something he had never admitted before, that someone within his control was no longer under it. So he observed, closely, intently, looking for inconsistencies, looking for signs of failure, looking for anything that would reaffirm his dominance. But what he found was not submission, not resistance, but independence. And that was far more dangerous, because independence cannot be controlled in the same way as resistance. Resistance fights against control. Independence exists outside of it. And Lila was beginning to exist outside his control entirely. She did not challenge him openly. She did not confront him directly. She did not attempt to dismantle his authority. Instead, she demonstrated control in a different way. Subtle, measured, unshakable. She made decisions without seeking approval. She adjusted to situations without relying on guidance. She navigated the environment with an awareness that exceeded expectation, and in doing so, she quietly established something that unsettled Dominic deeply. She was no longer reacting to him. She was acting independently of him, which meant he was no longer the center of her world. And that realization hit harder than any direct challenge ever could. Dominic's external reaction remained controlled, his expression unchanged, his posture unwavering, his authority intact. But internally, something shifted, a fracture, small, almost imperceptible, but present, because for the first time, he could not immediately categorize her behavior, and that disrupted his internal system, his structure, his certainty. He began to feel something unfamiliar, not weakness, not vulnerability, but uncertainty, and beneath that, something deeper, something more dangerous, obsession, not in the sense of attachment, but in the sense of fixation, because when something cannot be controlled, it demands understanding, and when it cannot be understood, it demands attention, and Lila was both. He found himself watching her more than necessary, analyzing her movements, tracking her decisions, observing her behavior with increasing intensity, not because he needed to, but because he could not stop. This shift did not go unnoticed within his own empire. Subordinates observed it, not directly, but subtly. The increased attention, the prolonged observation, the deviation from his usual focus. And that was enough to raise quiet questions, because Dominic Vale did not lose focus. Not like this. Not for someone he considered an asset. But Lila was no longer an asset. She was something else entirely, and he was beginning to realize that, slowly, reluctantly, but undeniably. Meanwhile, Lila remained composed, unshaken, aware. She did not react to his scrutiny. She did not respond to his presence. She did not attempt to draw attention to herself. Instead, she continued to move with quiet intention, maintaining her independence, strengthening her understanding of the system around her, and reinforcing something that Dominic had not anticipated. She was not afraid, not of him, not of his empire, not of his control, and that absence of fear was more powerful than any form of resistance, because fear is what keeps control intact. Without fear, control begins to lose its foundation, and that was happening without announcement, without confrontation, without visible disruption, just a gradual erosion, subtle, persistent, unavoidable. Dominic began questioning something he had never questioned before, not his authority, but his understanding of it. Because if Lila was not reacting as expected, then perhaps his framework was incomplete. Perhaps his control was not as absolute as he believed. Perhaps There were elements within his world he had not accounted for. And if that were true, then everything he had built was not as secure as he thought. That realization was not something he accepted easily, but it was something he could not ignore, because Lila Mercer was not behaving like someone who was trapped, or owned, or controlled. She was behaving like someone who had chosen her position, which raised a dangerous question. Had she ever been trapped at all? Or had she allowed herself to be placed there? That thought lingered, uncomfortable, unsettling, persistent, because if true, then the entire foundation of his perception was wrong. And that was not something he could afford to overlook. As he continued observing her, something became increasingly clear. She was not attempting to escape. She was not fighting for freedom. She was not struggling against her circumstances, because she did not see herself as a prisoner, which meant she had never accepted his control in the first place. And if she had never accepted it, then she had never truly been under it, which meant he had never actually owned her. And that was the moment everything shifted, not externally, but internally, because ownership without acceptance is nothing more than illusion. And Dominic had just realized that the illusion he had believed in was no longer intact. His control remained, his structure remained, his authority remained. But something had changed beneath it all, something irreversible, because Lila Mercer was no longer a person within his control. She was something beyond it, and that was what he began to understand. Not fully, not clearly, but enough to realize she was never trying to escape, because she was never his to begin with. He said she could never leave him, but the truth was he didn't want her to. In the world ruled by Dominic Vale, control had always been his defining force. Control of his empire, control of his enemies, control of every variable within his reach. But now, control was no longer enough, because something had begun to replace it. Something far more consuming. Obsession. It did not arrive suddenly. It grew, quietly, persistently, inevitably. At first, it manifested as attention, not unusual in itself. Dominic was always observant, always calculating, always aware. But this attention was different. It was no longer purely strategic. It was personal. He began focusing on Lila Mercer in ways that went beyond necessity, watching her movements not just for analysis, but for understanding, monitoring her environment not just for control, but for safety. Subtly at first, then increasingly, he adjusted his routines to align with hers, altered decisions based on her presence, shifted priorities in ways that contradicted his own established hierarchy. And that was the first sign, because Dominic Vale did not shift priorities, not for anyone, not for anything. But Lila was becoming the exception. The structure of his world began to feel slightly misaligned, not broken, not collapsed, but disrupted, because for the first time, his decisions were not purely driven by power. They were influenced, and influence is the beginning of loss of control. Others began to notice, not openly, not directly, but in small ways, his increased presence around her, his attention during critical moments, his hesitation before making decisions that would typically be instant. These were not behaviors associated with Dominic Vale, and yet they were becoming more frequent. Subordinates observed, advisors questioned, all silently, because no one openly questioned Dominic Vale. But internally, the concern grew, because a man like Dominic did not become distracted unless something significant had changed. And something had, but not in the way they assumed, because this was not distraction. It was attachment, and attachment was something far more dangerous than distraction. Dominic began prioritizing Lila in ways that conflicted with his operations. Decisions that would have once been made swiftly were now reconsidered, not because of weakness, but because of her. He found himself factoring her into scenarios where she did not belong, adjusting outcomes, reevaluating risks, not for strategic gain, but for preservation. And that was something entirely new. Because Dominic Vale did not preserve. He controlled. He dominated. He eliminated risk. But now, he was protecting something. Someone, without fully acknowledging it, without openly admitting it. But undeniably, he was changing. Externally, he remained composed, structured, dominant. But internally, something had shifted. A quiet dependence was forming, one he did not welcome, but could not ignore. Meanwhile, Lila Mercer remained unchanged in appearance, but not in awareness. She had noticed a shift from the beginning because awareness was her strength. She saw patterns, recognized changes, and adapted accordingly. She understood that Dominic's behavior toward her was no longer purely driven by control. It had evolved. His attention lingered longer than necessary. His proximity increased without explanation. His decisions subtly adjusted in her presence. And while others saw confusion, she saw intent, but she did not resist. She did not confront. She did not challenge. Instead, she observed and adjusted, maintaining her position, maintaining her control, because she knew something important. Power does not always need to be taken. Sometimes it is given, and she was careful not to give anything away. But Dominic's shift was undeniable. His possessiveness increased, not aggressively, but subtly. He ensured her safety more than required, limited her exposure without explicitly restricting her, monitored her environment with heightened awareness, not as a captor, but as someone who could not afford to lose what he now valued. And that was the shift from control to fear of loss, from dominance to attachment, from authority to emotional investment. And this change was not one he could easily reverse, because once attachment forms, control becomes secondary, and Dominic Vale was not prepared for that. But the more he tried to suppress it, the more it grew, because Lila was not reacting in a way that diminished his interest. She was not feeding his control, but she was not rejecting his presence either. She remained balanced, aware, composed, and that created a tension that neither could fully resolve, because now they were no longer operating in a dynamic of control versus submission. They were operating in something else entirely, something undefined, unstable, and deeply intense. There were moments, brief but powerful, where their interactions carried weight beyond words. A glance, a pause, a moment of silence that felt longer than it should. Each interaction layered with unspoken awareness, neither fully yielding, neither fully dominating, but both fully aware, and that awareness was dangerous because it created a connection that could not be ignored. And once something cannot be ignored, it becomes impossible to remove. Dominic began questioning himself, not his power, not his empire, but his own internal response. Why did he feel the need to be near her? Why did her presence influence his decisions? Why did her absence create discomfort? These questions were new, unfamiliar, and unwelcome, but they continued to surface, because Lila Mercer was no longer just a variable. She had become something else, something he could not categorize, something he could not fully control. And that was unsettling, because Dominic Vale had built his life around certainty, around structure, around control, and Lila was disrupting all three. But despite the tension, despite the internal conflict, despite the shift, he could not bring himself to step away, to distance himself, to remove her from his world, because something deeper had taken root, something he could not easily detach from, something that had begun to define his actions without his consent. He tried to maintain balance, to preserve control, to continue operating as he always had. But every decision now carried an additional weight, every choice a consideration of her, and that was not sustainable, not for someone like him. But he could not stop, because the idea of her absence was becoming more difficult to accept than the presence of control. And that was the moment he began to realize something he had never acknowledged before, that losing her was no longer just a possibility. It was a threat, not to his empire, not to his authority, but to him, to something within him that he had not recognized until now. And that realization changed everything, because control can be regained, power can be rebuilt, but something that becomes essential cannot be easily replaced. And Lila was becoming essential. He stood in silence, watching her from across the room, observing, thinking, feeling something he could not fully define, something that conflicted with everything he believed about himself. And in that moment, the truth became clear, and it unsettled him more than anything he had ever faced, because he finally understood losing her isn't his fear, losing her is... The truth didn't break them. It redefined everything between them. In the world controlled by Dominic Vale, truth had always been a weapon, a tool, a means to an end, but this truth was different because it did not destroy. It transformed. It began quietly, not with confrontation, not with exposure, but with presence. Lila Mercer had never been fully understood, not by Dominic, not by his empire, not by anyone who had crossed her path. She had remained a controlled mystery, a carefully constructed silence. But now, that silence was beginning to unravel, not all at once, but in fragments, small revelations, subtle confirmations, pieces of a larger picture that had been hidden in plain sight. And as Dominic began to see those pieces, he realized something that forced him to reassess everything. Lila Mercer had not been placed in his world by chance. She had been positioned, strategically, deliberately, with purpose. Her presence was not accidental. It was intentional. And that realization was the first fracture in the illusion he had built, because she was not just a captive. She was not just a variable. She was not just someone he had acquired. She was connected to something larger, something that reached beyond his empire, beyond his influence, beyond his control. And that connection was the truth that changed everything. As the details emerged, the structure of the past began to reveal itself. Lila Mercer was tied to a rival faction, one that had remained outside Dominic's reach, outside his understanding, a faction that had observed him from a distance, studied his movements, analyzed his decisions, and waited not for weakness, but for opportunity. And Lila was that opportunity, or at least she had been intended to be. But something had changed, because the person who was sent into Dominic's world had not acted as expected. She had not executed blind loyalty. She had not followed a predetermined path. She had not fulfilled the role she was meant to play. Instead, she had adapted, observed, and evolved, because Lila Mercer was not just a tool of a faction. She was something far more complex, a product of strategy, but also a force of her own. And that complexity was what made her dangerous and fascinating, and now understandable, because her behavior, her silence, her awareness, it all began to align, not as a coincidence, but as a plan that was no longer fully under control. Because somewhere along the way, Lila Mercer had begun to operate independently, not as an asset, not as a weapon, but as an individual with her own agenda. And Dominic was no longer certain where she stood. But one thing was clear: she was not his enemy, not fully, and not his ally either. She existed in a space between, and that was more dangerous than either, because in that space, loyalty becomes uncertain, and uncertainty is where power shifts. The realization did not come with anger, not immediately. Instead, it came with understanding, a quiet, unsettling understanding, because Dominic Vale did not fear betrayal. He expected it, prepared for it, built systems to withstand it. But this was not betrayal in the traditional sense. This was alignment. Two forces that had intersected without fully revealing their intentions. And now, they were no longer operating blindly. They were aware of each other, of the truth, of the implications. And that awareness changed everything, because now there was no longer deception between them, only understanding, and something deeper, something that neither had fully acknowledged before. Respect, not forced, not strategic, but earned through observation, through endurance, through the ability to exist within a system designed to break others, and not only survive it, but navigate it. Lila Mercer had done that, and Dominic recognized it, not openly, but internally, because for the first time, he saw her as more than just a presence in his world. He saw her as someone who had withstood it, and that changed his perception of her entirely. The power dynamic shifted, not abruptly, but steadily. No longer was it a matter of control versus submission, no longer a clear hierarchy of dominance. Instead, it became something far more complex, a balance, not perfect, but stable, a silent equilibrium that neither could fully dominate, because both now understood the other, not completely, but enough, and that was enough to prevent imbalance. For now, the emotional tension that had always lingered between them evolved. It was no longer rooted in uncertainty, but in awareness, a deeper, more intricate form of connection, one that could not be easily severed. Because once two individuals understand each other at that level, the distance between them begins to dissolve, and something else begins to form, something neither expected, but both felt. Dominic found himself studying her not as a subject, but as a counterpart. Lila observed him not as a threat, but as a force, and within that mutual awareness, a connection began to take shape, not soft, not fragile, but intense and unyielding, because now there was no illusion between them, no misunderstanding, no blind dominance, only truth, and within that truth, something unexpected emerged. Attraction, not simple, not surface level, but layered, complicated, built on tension, understanding, and the undeniable recognition of power. They were no longer operating as opposing forces. They were converging, not fully aligned, but no longer divided, and that was far more dangerous, because when two powerful forces begin to align, they create something that cannot be easily controlled, something unpredictable, something transformative, something that has the potential to either stabilize everything or destroy it entirely, and neither of them was willing to let go of that possibility. Dominic knew now, with certainty, that Lila Mercer was not just someone who had entered his world. She was someone who had changed it, fundamentally, irreversibly, and that realization did not push him away. It drew him closer, because for the first time, he was not looking to control her. He was trying to understand her, to keep her within his reach, not as an object, but as something far more valuable, something that could not be easily replaced. And that was a dangerous shift, because once something becomes irreplaceable, it becomes impossible to let go. And in that moment, as the truth settled between them, as the tension stabilized, as the connection deepened, Dominic made a decision, not out of strategy, not out of control, but out of something else, something that defied everything he had ever believed about himself. Because even after everything, he still doesn't let her go. He pulls her closer instead,